Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga, a series in which we are taking a look at different works of sword and sorcery, sword and planet, and appendix in fiction. And we are kicking off this series in 2022 with a look at one of the big ones, one of the heavy hitters, and that is, of course, Michael Moorcock's Elric Saga. So in this first episode, we are going to be taking a little look at my history with the series, a look at the history of the series in general, and then we will be doing detailed reviews of the first two books, the first two novels in the series, and that is Elric of Melniboné, published in 1972, and Sailor on the Seas of Fate, published in 1976. So first, a little word on the word Melniboné. There are many different ways to pronounce this word, and Michael Moorcock, the author, has himself said that there is really not one super right 100% correct way. As different readers read the word, they might pronounce it in a different way. I used to say Melniboné, but I am now trying to say Melniboné, and the people of Melniboné are called the Melnibonéans. So that is the way that I'm saying the word now. I might revert back to an older way that I used to say it, which was Melniboné. But however you want to say it, it is a made-up fantasy word. So I guess just try to be consistent, but I may not be consistent. But as of right now, January 2022, the Elric Saga is my favorite work of sword and sorcery fiction. There might be something out there that I like more, and I'm hoping there is, because I always want to keep that option open of loving something new. But yeah, as of right now, the Elric Saga is my favorite. It perfectly captures everything I love about the genre, and it has informed many of the kinds of games and things I like to cover on this channel. It is relentlessly weird, told with brevity, it's somber, philosophical, and otherworldly. So for a long time, it was a little difficult to get into the Elric Saga because it was difficult to know what to read and in what order to read. If you're interested in the publication history, I do recommend reading the Wikipedia article, which is just under the heading Elric of Melniboné. But it was originally serialized in at least one magazine, possibly more, released as short stories, novelettes, and novellas. Moorcock would then go on to rework and add connecting bits to turn the stories into novels, and he would also change the order of the stories to create an internal chronological order. The stories were originally told out of chronological order, and so that had to be modified when the novels were compiled and released. So this can lead to some tonal inconsistencies in the novels. It can create some stylistic inconsistencies, and it can also create some problems with plotting. But because of the overall dreamlike nature of the entire series, I don't really find this to be a problem. Each story, each book is better viewed as opening up a window, opening up a portal to a certain part of Elric's life, and we are allowed a glimpse of that portion of its life before the window closes, and then the world continues to exist while we are not reading. So my history with the series, I probably first read them in 1991. I was in high school. I did have a science fiction and fantasy class, and for one of the best field trips ever, maybe the best field trip ever, our science fiction and fantasy class went to a bookstore, went to one of the new giant Barnes & Noble that had opened up in my hometown. And our assignment was to pick a book, buy it, and then do a report on it. And I was instantly drawn to the covers of the Ace Fantasy paperbacks drawn by Robert Gould. His color pencil art on the front just really spoke to me. I was really into color pencil art at the time. And I also really liked that the book was short, which means it would be easy to read for a class and do a report on. Additionally, the entire series was in print, and I was able to go back and get the rest of the series after finishing and loving Volume 1. Up until that point, most of my fantasy reading had been informed by Tolkien and, in turn, Dungeons & Dragons, with things like The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Dragonlance, Shannara, Tad Williams and the Dragonbone Chair, Xanth novels, and various other D&D and Forgotten Realms novels. In addition to game books like Lone Wolf and Fighting Fantasy. I had read small samplings of Sword and Sorcery at that point. Definitely some Conan, perhaps some Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, just various stories scattered in various anthologies from the library. But Elric was a very different kind of fantasy. Moorcock would purposefully set out to write an anti-Tolkien fantasy with this. And it was one that actually intensely spoke to my kind of Gen X sensibilities as I look back in time. I was drawn to Elric's sadness, his cynical outlook on life. If he was a teen in the 80s or early 90s, he might have been listening to The Smiths, The Cure, Zymox, or The Damned, something like that. It was a very anti-Tolkien approach. This wasn't a long, epic quest to save the world. These were shorter quests, shorter little adventures. And it also reminded me a great deal of the Games Workshop games that I was playing at the time. And I would later come to find that the Elric Saga was a huge influence on Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston at Games Workshop. You had the great old ones, the old gods, the Lords of Law and Chaos, an ancient reptilian race that could have been the basis for the Cold Ones. You had otherworldly planes of existence, alien technology mixed in an old world setting, dangerous magic, cursed swords, and interdimensional travel. Elric was my gateway into a whole new world of fantastic fiction, one that would lead to a whole new world of weird fiction and much more. So I want to start off with a review of the saga and the novels by addressing a common complaint of Elric, the character, and his saga. And that complaint is that Elric is merely a pawn in his own stories. He rarely has agency. It often seems like his choices don't matter. He is like a dried leaf being blown by the winds of law and chaos to and fro from one adventure to the next. And while I think that is somewhat true, I don't view that as a negative. Elric is a tragedy. He is doomed from the get-go. It's even hinted at in his many nicknames and his many names that people call him, such as Elric Womanslayer, Elric Kinslayer, the Pale Prince of Ruins, the Doomed Prince. In this tragedy, a character cannot escape his fate. He must live with the cards he is dealt, and Elric has to live like that. We know it is a tragedy from the very beginning of Book 1. I want to read just a beginning paragraph here that gives that away. This is at the very beginning of Book 1. It's a little synopsis paragraph, a little introductory paragraph. It says, "On the island kingdom of Melniboné, all the old rituals are still observed, though the nation's power has waned for 500 years, and now her way of life is maintained only by her trade with the young kingdoms, and the fact that the city of Emir has become the meeting place of merchants. Are those rituals no longer useful? Can the rituals be denied and doom avoided? One who would rule in Emperor Elric's stead prefers to think not. He says that Elric will bring destruction to Melniboné by his refusal to honor all the rituals. Elric honors many. And now opens the tragedy, which will close many years from now and precipitate the destruction of this world." I mean, it pretty much lays it out right there in that beginning paragraph that this book is not going to have a happy ending. The saga is not going to have a happy ending. Elric's main quest throughout all the books is to rid himself of this doom, most likely through his own death, his own demise. Here we have a fantasy where the main character's goal is not to save the world, but the main character's goal is to probably commit suicide, to rid himself of the doom and the doom he passes around. His quest ultimately is to reach the city of Tanalorn, a city existing beyond the influences of law and chaos, a city where Elric can escape his fate, rest in peace, and not bring doom upon all he encounters. So now let's take a look at Elric of Melniboné, and this is the first volume, the first novel, and this is part 1. I do want to read a little bit of the opening chapter here, and that chapter is called A Melancholy King. A court strives to honor him. It is the color of a bleached skull, his flesh, and the long hair which flows below his shoulders is milk white. From the tapering beautiful head stare 2 slanting eyes, crimson and moody, and from the loose sleeves of his yellow gown emerge 2 slender hands, also the color of bone, resting on each arm of a seat which has been carved from a single massive ruby. The crimson eyes are troubled, and sometimes one hand will rise to finger the light helm which sits upon the white locks, a helm made from some dark greenish alloy and exquisitely molded into the likeness of a dragon about to take wing. And on the hand which absently caresses the crown, there is a ring in which is set a single rare octorious stone, whose core sometimes shifts sluggishly and reshapes itself, as if it were sentient smoke and as restless in its jeweled prison as the young albino on his ruby throne. So there we get a little example of Moorcock's prose. It is kind of flowery and lyrical, and that would make sense because Moorcock would go on to contribute lyrics and music to quite a few, I believe, at least a handful of prog rock bands in the 70s, especially with Hawkwind, which he worked on an album of Elric Saga stories and songs with Hawkwind. So much happens in the first book of this series. If this was written by a modern author for a modern publisher, this single book would probably be an entire trilogy, with each volume being 500 plus pages. But instead we are presented with a very slim volume that's under 200 pages, and it is absolutely overflowing with plot and creativity. Moorcock creates a fantasy reduction in which all of the fat is trimmed and boiled away. In this, he creates a work that is purposefully anti-Tolkien, purposefully anti-epic in a way. And the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part sets up Elric's character. His love in his life is Cimmeril. And it sets up his reluctance to rule over the ancient kingdom of Melniboné, his ultimate betrayal at the hands of his wicked cousin Yyrkoon. Melniboné is an ancient and dying kingdom, geographically flanked by the young kingdoms, and it's finding its place in the world threatened. As Roland might say, the world has moved on for the Melnibonéans. It is a kingdom inhabited by a race of cruel and uncaring people. The Melnibonéans are into torture, they maim and mutilate. The first chapter describes a chorus of singers that they have, who each one has been surgically altered to sing but one perfect note. They are cold, they are deceitful and malicious. The outsiders call it an Isle of Demons, and Elric wants no part of it. We also learn here that Elric is addicted to potions to keep himself physically fit. What we're going to see time and time again throughout the series is that Elric's power does not come from within. Many fantasies are about the power within the hero, or a heroine discover that he had the power all along. But Elric's power mostly comes from external sources and from his curiosity to learn and to gain knowledge. He himself is weak and frail. His power comes from potions, from his magical sword, and from the gods of chaos. Left to his own devices, he would be a pathetic albino, not able to die, but also not able to fully live. The second part of the book sets the stage for Elric's interactions with the lords of law and chaos and the gods of the earth and land, or the sea and land, I should say. This part establishes the pantheon of the world, and shows how powerful the external divine beings really are. Elric is granted the use of a ship which sails over land and sea, but he is also tossed around like a plaything and kind of discarded like an old toy by the gods of land and sea. While the gods may grant Elric extreme power, they also really make sure that he knows his place, he knows his station. He needs them. They don't need him. The third part of the book details Elric's violent clash with Yrkun, his evil cousin, and the quest for two rune blades, Stormbringer and Mournblade. On his quest through the marshes of Limbo and through the tunnel of pulsating flesh, Elric meets Rakir the Red Archer, a warrior priest of Foom. Rakir is another manifestation of the Eternal Champion, and so is Elric. And this is probably the earliest hint of the Elric saga being tied to a multiverse of characters and stories that Moorcock has created. The Eternal Champion is a kind of hero throughout the ages of time and space. And Moorcock writes about many incarnations of this champion, and they often appear in each other's books, creating this intertwined multi-universe. But like most people who meet Elric, Rakir's eventual fate is not a pleasant one. Elric finally finds his black rune sword Stormbringer, his cousin gets Mournblade, and this even more securely seals Elric's doomed fate. Because Stormbringer, it's a cursed sword. It's a physical manifestation of a chaos demon that feeds upon the souls of all who the blade cuts. The souls give power to Elric, and they also power the sword. But Elric he's often unable to control the sword because it is its own sentient killing machine. And in one of the main decisions that Elric makes throughout his saga, a final decision that will lead to even more doom, Elric decides to spare his cousin's life. Yrkun is returned to Melniboné to act as a standing emperor, while Elric abandons his kingdom in search of adventure and possibly peace in the young kingdoms. He's on a quest for knowledge, a quest for adventure, really. And in one of the most ironic ending lines in all of fantasy, Elric proclaims with some amount of optimism, "I shall be a new man when I return to Melniboné." That line really stuck out to me when I was reading the series this time. So now on to book 2, Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and I want to read this opening paragraph, this little introduction here. And this says, "Due to recent disruptions in the fabric of our worlds, beings have been released who would not otherwise have the power they now possess. And possessing great power, they crave for more, for all the power that there is in our universe. They are outside the power of any of our gods. So a more powerful group has been summoned, yourselves, the champions eternal, in 4 of his incarnations, and 4 is the maximum number we can risk without precipitating further unwelcome disruptions among the planes of Earth, Ericos, Elric, Corum, and Hawkmoon." And that really does lead into this first part. So right off the bat, what we're going to quickly find is that even though there is a chronological order to the saga, there are large gaps in time. Things happen in between the novels that we don't know. And Moorcock really isn't concerned with creating a point-by-point, strongly serialized work throughout the novels. Like I said before, each book, each story is just a glimpse into a certain part of Elric's life. So Sailor of the Seas of Fate contains 3 novellas, each one focusing on an adventure as Elric sails the mystic seas. Book 1 is called The Sailing to the Future, and it is on its own one of my favorite works of all fantasy. It's absolutely bonkers, and Elric finds himself stranded on this island. He often finds himself trapped and then miraculously gets rescued and gets thrust into some other adventure, thus leading to that kind of complaint that I read earlier, or we talked about earlier. And he is rescued by this magic sailing vessel that emanates its own mist. And on that sailing vessel, he is joined by 3 other incarnations of the Eternal Champion. Each of them is given charge over a band of warriors, and they are sent on a quest to destroy 2 sorcerers. And this is where the series really starts to show its alien and otherworldly leanings. I'm pretty sure that one of the evil sorcerers that they have to fight is actually a sentient spaceship. And the other is like its pilot, who shares this biological and symbiotic connection. And the 4 Eternal Champions also pull a total Voltron move, and they combine together into this single monstrous entity that has a head with 4 faces, each facing in a cardinal direction, 8 arms, and all of these crazy swords. It's totally insane and amazing. Book 2 is called Sailing to the Present, and unfortunately, I don't think this part really holds up after the amazing first part. This is kind of like the first kind of dip, I think, in quality in the Elric stories. It's not bad, it just feels like a few steps back from everything that has come before it. And this is really kind of a gothic love/ghost story in which Elric finds himself entangled in a domestic and supernatural dispute. But it is here that he meets another one of his doomed companions, and that is Count Smorgon Baldhead. Great name. There are some amazing names in the Elric saga. Book 3 is called Sailing to the Past, and it really ends the book on a high note. And it is here that we have one of the purest kind of sword and sorcery style stories featuring Elric. The doomed prince, along with his new companion, Count Smorgon Baldhead, they find passage on a new ship which leads them on a new quest, one in which they travel back in time to the ancient city that could be the very birthplace of the Melnibonéans, and perhaps the cradle of life for the Chaos Gods. It is also a place where a violent and ancient reptilian race exists, perhaps the basis for the Cold Ones in Warhammer. This is a classic tale of treasure hunting, monster slaying, and jungle exploration. And once again, things don't turn out well for those who link their lives with Elric. So the best thing I can say about Elric, and really a great kind of conclusion to this first episode, is that the stories are rarely formulaic. You almost never know what you're going to get once you start a new Elric story. Each one is different, and Moorcock is he's never afraid to embrace the weird and the outlandish and the otherworldly. Moorcock refers to Elric as sword and philosophy, and during these 2 books we do start to see that, as Elric and his companions often talk about the meaning of life, existential nihilism, and what it means for them just to exist in their own worlds. There is an alien-like mist that permeates the entire saga, one that makes the world feel bizarre and dangerous. While it is a work of fantasy, there also seems to be elements of science fiction and perhaps even some post-apocalyptic genres scattered about. And it is a work of fantasy that fully embraces the fantastic. It is not afraid to be a work of fantasy, of the fantasy genre. Like, I feel like so many modern fantasies, they seem ashamed of what they are, but Elric embraces it in all of its meaning. And that really is why I love it so much. Sorry guys, I hope you enjoyed this first episode, taking a look at the Elric saga. Come back probably in a couple weeks where we will take a look at books 3 and 4. So alright guys, well, I'll talk to you later. Take it easy. Bye-bye.